Okay, so this is the data set that you should have on your screen that I emailed you. And the goal or the objective of this video is to show you how to make a histogram in Excel. And then we can compare these data sets by a histogram. And hopefully along the way we'll learn a couple other things as well. So first things first, I made us a little data table here because it's important to know the minimum and the maximum value from each data set before we can actually make a histogram. So what this is here is this is the number of home runs from the American League in the MLB, and this is the number of home runs in the National League in the MLB. So what we're going to do is make a histogram, and the first thing we need to do is figure out what's the smallest number, what's the largest number, so we can figure out what bin sizes we want to use. Now we could just look here and say, well, it looks like 35 is the smallest, but just so you can see how cool Excel is, what we're going to do is click here in this cell. We're going to say this cell equals, and we're going to type equals. We're going to start to type minimum, M-I-N, and if you look here, a function pops up for us to say min. So you're going to click on min, and then it gives you a set of parentheses to highlight the range that you want to find the minimum value. So highlight the American League and press enter, and it should give you the minimum of 35, which we already know. Next, we can find the maximum value. So we click on this cell here and say this cell is equal to the maximum value. Select our function for maximum, gives us our parentheses, highlight again the maximum or the American League, and press enter, and it gives us our minimum and our maximum. Now we want to do the same thing for the National League. So under the National League, we're going to say this cell is equal to the minimum value, selecting the minimum function, highlighting this time the National League, selecting enter, and doing the same thing for the maximum value. This cell is equal to the maximum of the National League. So we get 29 and 67. Now, the cool thing about Excel is, let's say I didn't do this and I accidentally deleted them. Well, instead of having to redo everything that I just did, Excel, if you select this cell here and you put your cursor over the bottom right line, it turns black. See how it turns from white to black? If I drag this over, it's going to drag everything over to the right. So look, it found this found the minimum of this row. Now if I drag it to the right like so, it will find the minimum of this row. So again, if I come down here to the function that I did here, it says maximum of this row right here, A2 to A15, which is the first row. If I click in the bottom right corner, oops, let me undo that there. If I click at the bottom right corner of this cell where it turns black like so, drag it over, it will give me the maximum of the next column over. Okay, so now my range is from 35 to 77 and 29 to 67. So I need to make my bins, which I'm going to do down here, to incorporate all these numbers because I'm going to make a histogram for American League and a histogram for the National League. So first, in class we learned to go from to, let's say if I wanted to start at 25, I'm going to start at 25, and in class we said to less than 30, right? Or to less than 31, whatever it is we want it to be. Well, in Excel, it works a little bit different. So instead, I'm just going to say I want my bins to start at 25, and I want them to be a size of 5. So if I type 25 and I go up to 30, and then I want my next bin to go up to 35. So what this is saying here is, and I'm calling these bins, but we call them classes or bins in class. So this class or bin right here says how many numbers are there in this data set between 26 to and including 30. To and including 30. So it's a little bit different than what we did in class, but it's going to give us the same exact thing. So I'm going to keep going. This bin here will give me everything that is between 29 to and including, not 29, 31 to and including 35. So I'm going to keep adding until I get all of my data points. Now another cool thing about Excel is if I highlight these four, it'll notice that I'm counting by 5, and I can drag down until I get to my highest number was 77, so I need to go to at least 80. Now I've got my bins created. I'm going to find the frequency, or how many there are that fall into each bin. So I'm going to say this is the American League. I'm going to say this is the National League. Okay, so now Excel is cool because it'll help us to count how many there are without us actually having to do it. So if I highlight all of these cells in the American League, and I say I want all of these cells, and I press equals, and I start to type frequency, you can see a frequency function pops up. So select frequency, and it gives me parentheses with two things, a data array and a bins array. The first thing I need is the data. So I'm going to go up here and highlight the data I want. Then I'm going to press a comma, and it takes me over to my next part, the bins array. So I'm going to highlight what bins do I want to use. I want to use this set of bins right here. Now you need to make sure your parentheses are closed off. I got the starting and the ending. Now the most important part is when I finish this, since I'm operating in multiple cells, I have to select Command, Shift, and Enter at the same time. Command, Shift, and Enter. And now look, it adds up how many are between 0 to and including 25. Well, there's none, I know that already. How many are between 26 and 2 and including 30, and I know there are 0 there because my first number is 35 looking up here. But if we have a larger data set, this is more helpful. So we're going to do the same thing for the National League. Find the frequency. We're going to highlight all of these. We're going to say each of these are equal to the frequency. First we're going to put in our data. For the National League, it's here. Press comma, and we're going to enter our bins. We're going to use the same bins because remember, if we're comparing histograms, we got to make sure the scales are the same. Then I'm going to hit Command, Shift, and Enter, and it will give me the frequency for the National League. Okay, now our last step, we're going to actually make these histograms. So I'm going to highlight the American League. I'm going to go up here to Charts, and I want to put in a column chart or a bar chart. We're going to do clustered, and if you look here, it starts to look a little bit like a histogram. There is one problem. Only problem is our histogram tells us the number of home runs on the x-axis. Here, this is saying there was one that had 3 home runs. One season had 3 home runs, and that's not true because all of our seasons had more than 3, right? They all had 35 or more. So we need to change our x-axis. So up here, I'm going to go up to Select Data right here, and I'm going to come down to where it's our x-axis, and I'm going to highlight my bins because I want my bins to be my x-axis here. And then I select OK, and look, how many had 35? There was 1. If I look up here, there was 1 with 35. The last problem is I got all these gaps. Histograms are not supposed to have gaps. So I need to double click, go to my gap width, and change that to 0. Select OK, and now I've got my histogram. So you can keep the key if you want to, or you can delete it. And then shrink this down so that it will fit on one page when you print it off. So it should fit right in here like this. You just got to look at this dotted line here. And then we can do the same thing for our National League. So I'm going to highlight the National League. I'm going to go to Charts, Clustered Chart. First thing I'm going to do is change the x-axis to what it needs to be. So I'm going to come up to Select Data, over here to x-axis. I'm going to again select my bins, select OK. I need to get rid of the gaps now, so I double click and I change my gap width to 0, hit enter, and I'm going to delete my key so I can see more of the graph. And then slide this over so it'll fit on one page here. And it looks like that. So now I've got two histograms and I can compare these data sets and say, well, which one do I think did better? And looking here, it looks like the mean, or the most of the data in the American League is higher, but it also looks like the American League might be more spread out. So the last thing I want to do is we can talk about our measures of center, our mean, and our standard deviation for spread. And looking here, it looks roughly symmetric, so I know I want to use the mean. So I can come up here and I can find the mean of the American League. I'm going to say this cell equals, if I start to type average here, AV, I'm going to use the average, which is the same as the mean, and I'm going to highlight the American League. That gives me the average of the American League, 56.93, and I can find the average of the National League. So I'm going to go and select average and highlight the National League. So there I can see easy comparison. On average, the American had more home runs than the National, and measure of spread, standard deviation. So I'm going to say this cell equals STD, and I'm going to use this stands for standard deviation of the population, and we're going to use that one there and select the data for the American League, hit enter, and do the same for the National League. Now I've got all the measures that I need. Looking here, I can see the average was higher in the American League, but the standard deviation was higher. So what does that standard deviation mean? It means the average distance from the mean was larger by 2 home runs than it was in the National League. So now we can compare these two data sets.